I'm going to talk for 5 people. I've done it for a few hundred, so it's a wide range. So first of all, thank you for having me, and thank you for joining this talk. And I'm going to give just a little bit, quite a history of the lessons I've learned over my career. I'm almost as old as Mario. Almost, just a few years behind. So I've been in the industry for close to 25 years. And through that, learned a lot, and definitely more on the business side. Just at a high level, I end up selling my business to Unity Technologies. This is closed the deal in March 2020. If you all remember March 2020, I don't think you were allowed to leave New Zealand then. And so in Canada, I think we signed the paperwork. You got to imagine, I think we're probably the only M&A acquisition to close that month. Because at the time, no one knew what the future was. But the deal was strategic, and I still remember Dave Rhodes and John Mercatella, who were sponsors. They're like, we don't know what the future is, but let's go continue this. We believe in this, stepping forward. And at its height, and we all know the crazy cycle we've just been through, I ended up scaling my division up to, I had 900 people reporting to me, plus another 300 contractors were working for us. We were over close to 100 million in revenue, and at the top, I think we were represented about $6 billion to Unity's market cap. So absolutely crazy experience. And just imagine this came from, upon the acquisition, I was doing about $15 million US in revenue. So I managed to do that over 3.5 years. But that just doesn't happen by luck. It happens by some core lessons, an incredible management team, and a bunch of those different pieces that end up locking together. So I want to start, I guess, the last one, a little bit of the origin story, because I think it's really relevant, the lessons I learned over my career. And so started, I think, in 1999. Well, definitely as a university kid, and at the time in high school, was definitely hung out with the nerds. We were doing, I remember some of the people were older. There was the demo scene, Second Reality, doing a bunch of different work in that space. And we ended up doing a small startup called Xerius Development, and we did this Mac sound system. And we ended up getting this phone call from this person called Tim Sweeney, and it said, hey, we're doing this port of Unreal Tournament to the Mac, but we need a sound engine, and we needed performance, so can you rewrite your sound engine in assembly? And we're like, we didn't know what we're doing. We said, sure. And so that was our first taste of real game development. And of course, at that time, so this is like 98, 99, this thing called the internet came along. So we started getting these requests to doing websites. And we ended up growing a small business all the way up to from just like a couple kids from 0 to about $2.5 million in revenue. We had 40 employees. And we ended up having like one major anchor client called Qtrace. We ended up building, which is crazy at the time, a whole financial stock trading platform in our early 20s. And one of the lessons that we kind of learned back then that really kind of stuck home is that when the internet came along, although we were all university dropouts, we knew as much as anyone else because it was brand new. There was this big technology reset. And so we ended up and I still remember flying along. I thought, I was one of the managing partners. I thought this would never end. And I still remember the day that 9/11 happened, because I watched on TV the second plane crash into the building. And what I didn't know, 6 months later, we went from $2.5 million in revenue and 40 employees down to 4 employees, down to like $300,000 in revenue, and ended up basically giving our studio away to another company. And that was quite the shock. And one of the lessons learned that still applies today, don't be dependent on one source of income. And then on a personal level, I actually went from the top again. I had my red sports car, I had a beautiful apartment, and I was definitely living on next year's income. So I ended up also declaring bankruptcy, and ended up living back from a beautiful apartment, fancy sports car, to my parents' couch. And bankruptcy in Canada is really interesting. You can only have $1,000 after that of anything. So I pretty much just had to close on my back. And I thought it was really interesting. You'd appreciate this. giving your car back to a dealership because I had it on a lease. I just drove it in and I handed the keys and they're like, I declare bankruptcy. And they're like, okay. And then I took the bus home. And of course I got the bus money from my parents because I had nothing. And it was quite the interesting experience because it was the first time I've actually experienced depression. And I could not get out of bed for months. And it was funny, I think my parents allowed me to kind of live in misery for a little while, just to really, like, I don't know, just more the deep cut in the back to learn those lessons. And I think, from that, I definitely, it's hardened in my soul. I believe in runway. And especially on the personal side. I don't live on next year's revenue or my next paycheck. I live on the savings that I did 2 or 3 years ago. And I think as an entrepreneur, that's a critical piece. I see a lot of people being an entrepreneur, but they just don't have the personal savings to really see through. Because as I think Mary would know, and some of the conversations I had, there's always a point where you drag, there's the success and there's the rollover and lessons that you learn. And when I was on my couch, kind of in my misery, it was funny, I owe credit to my mom. She kept asking me, what are you passionate about? Kind of what's next? And, I decided, I want to make video games. I love video games. And it was my passion. And so I got my ass out of bed and I started applying for jobs. And I ended up getting an associate producer job down in San Francisco with a company called Blue Shift. And it was a great time for me. We actually just finished shipping. They finished shipping World Series Baseball 2K2. And we started this baseball project called World Baseball 2K3, the next version. And the last one was pretty well received, 80 Metacritic. And I joined this team. And I was actually responsible for the baseball stadiums and some of the basic gameplay out in the field as an associate producer, which is basically a fancy name for a project manager. But I was able to work with some real industry veterans. So John Salwitz, who's one of the partners, he created Paperboy. Doug Snyder, the whole Atari days in the 80s. He built the hardware. John Brooks wrote the rendering engine for Madden in 3D for the very first time. So you're working with some of the very best in the industry. And what they built, it was the first experience on working with a world-class team. And building and also learning what it takes to build a world-class product. Because we took things well beyond what you would expect in any game. So I pushed, I was fighting for, in the background, for the trees to move gently in the wind and adding this wind dynamic. And the engineers are like, we're not fucking doing that. I'm like, no, you got to do the wind dynamic and have the trees move. Fine, we'll do it. And then the other thing where I remember the meeting very specifically, we're in this meeting, and this designer, Dana Christensen, he was really pushing to do a wall jump. It's so jumping off the wall and getting that kind of iconic, grabbing the home run. Engineers, no way, and he pushed. Finally, one guy just, it took him he just worked nights for a week, and it was in the game. And then if you look at, and then the final thing that I think I was part of is I was working with this engineer, Rich Geldrich, and we ended up doing the first, on the Xbox, deferred shading real-time 3D engine with point lights, and we had it working at 60 frames per second on the original Xbox in 720p. And we were the first game ever to do that. And the guys at Microsoft are like, why did you do this? We're like, because we can. But that ended up being the best baseball title, probably not of all time, but at that time ever. And if you look at the reviews, the front cover is Jason Giambi doing or what the lead character doing the wall jump. All the reviews talked about the trees in the background. They talked about the graphics as being amazing because we took things well beyond what anyone would do. And a lot of those innovations happened at midnight. No one asked us to do that, but we just did it because we just felt that we had to. And it came from within, and especially within the team. And so that culture, one of the key lessons from that experience, it's just such a critical thing that I've always taken through my career is it's not about true leadership, comes from within the team. And I felt everyone on that team was a leader. And I felt that's one of the things I learned from the leadership is that they were making the game with us. And John Salwitz, I have to say this, he wrote the controller code. He was a terrible engineer because it was all go-to statements. You just think of the worst possible thing. But it felt amazing. And so the other big lesson to stuff is like, especially as some people, junior engineers, it's like just overthink and over-engineer things, when sometimes like the hack works. And of course, you think of history as like junior people come in like, oh, this is terrible, and they try to rewrite it, and then the project just never ships. And sometimes like there's things that are done for a reason, and that's why I think experience is such an important thing on a team. And they just did such a subtle way of like pulling us, so younger people, and learning that. And all those people of that company went on to do, like Rich Gelbart wrote the Halo Wars engine, worked on Dota graphics engine with Steam. You know, Matt Rice is working with like, some of the biggest titles of the Call of Duty. Like everybody went on to do amazing things. It was just something that really struck home with me. And you know, from that point, because I had actually had this previous business experience, I ended up starting within Blue Shift, not just working on the baseball game, but doing business development, trying to get the next contract, doing administration, because it was like all hands on deck. And I ended up getting recruited to work for an agency, a video game agency called Flashman Studios. And being a video game agency at the time, like I was a bit of a no one. And I worked for this guy named Brad Young. And I went on pretty much like this, speaking of taking risk, I had some savings, learned from my first lesson, so I had a bit of a runway. And I ended up taking like almost basically half of we ended up charging basically 10% for signing deals, and I got commission. 50% of that went to me and all my expenses, and I had a small basic retainer of a couple $1,000s a month. I ended up having an apartment. But to do that, I learned my lessons. I moved back to my parents to like make my cost zero. And you know, because I was no one, I got 3 different clients. I had a company called Zen Studios, which was based in Budapest, Hungary. Another company called Redfly Studio, which is based in Austin, Texas. And a company called Acronym Games in Vancouver. I think these are just important stories. 3 companies that were started in Budapest. No one knows. At that time, we're talking in early 2000s, Budapest could have been like at the other side of the world to America. And it was a small company of 5 people. Redfly was just 2 artists. And Acronym Games was just 2 engineers. And so I'll start the story with Zen Studios. I ended up flying to Budapest, and we spent some time to like what our strategy is going to be. So let's accept who we are. We're no one. No one knows who we are. But I looked around the studio, and the owner, Jolt, had pinballs, machines everywhere. He was a collector. And the team at lunch would always go and play pinball and had competitions. And so we ended up doing some research. And this is the time we had MPD data. And I looked in the PlayStation 1 era, there was a game called Kiss Pinball. It had a 35 Metacritic, and it sold like 3.5 million units. And you're like, huh. And then you look at the PlayStation 2 era and Xbox, there was no pinball game released. And you're like, well, there's definitely a market, but it just hasn't been served. And at the time, the Xbox 360 had this thing called Xbox Live Arcade. And we're like, huh. A pinball, Xbox Live Arcade, super casual. We think there's something could be there. Now, Microsoft didn't know who I was, so like, how do you like crack the code with Microsoft? And at the time, Microsoft, remember, I mean, just today's original, this is the Xbox 360. They had their camera that they wanted to do. So I ended up weaving my way and finding the person who was leading the camera unit, because I ended up pitching like, hey, what if we did pinball on Xbox Live Arcade, but you need content for the camera. You use your hands to wave the paddles. And now other people did recognize that pinball was going to be like a hit on the platform. So we were competing with 4 other pinball titles, but we ended up getting the chance to release on the platform because of our camera. So that was our unique value proposition. We skipped the line. And we ended up naming it, this was Pinball FX. And it was, I still remember the day it was released, because we didn't get real-time analytics then. We were like going through the leaderboards, but it sold like 30,000 units the first day. And over the first month, it sold 120,000 units. Now, a company in Budapest, you have to understand their cost base, like it changed the company forever. And so it ended up being, from pinball, like one of the highest grossing and best-selling titles in Xbox Live Arcade ever. But we had a strategy of just not releasing the title. Our next piece of the puzzle was we're like, hey, we want to do downloadable content, other pinball tables. So we ended up doing a license, and some people may know this individual, Adam Boyes. He was the head of production at Capcom, and we got the Street Fighter license. And so we ended up doing Street Fighter license for pinball, and it was the first game ever to have downloadable content. And that helped, one, drove sales of like the download content sold a couple 100,000 units, but it reinforced more sales with our original product. We're like, this is a good idea. So our next one was the Marvel license, the Star Wars license, and in fact, then we said, hey, we're going to move to other platforms. So then at the time, we launched the App Store, one of the first titles on PlayStation, then one of the first titles Zen Pinball was launched day 5 of the App Store and iOS when they had games. One single table at $5 sold like 100,000 units in the first week because it was a brand new concept. And even today, Zen Studios, if you've ever played digital pinball, they own the market. But you think about what the strategy was serving an undervalued market, like that we knew that exists, and being first. It's such an important element. And first in multiple pieces of innovation. And the other thing that we were the best. So we had a high Metacritic rating always. So both rated the best, and that was our moat in terms of other people. There was other people like, wow, I want to make a pinball title, but those pinball companies are like 10,000 and 20,000 units, and just never was able to penetrate. And then people were like, oh, they own the category. So big lesson here is especially on these new platforms as they come out, especially as a founder and entrepreneur, it's just critical. You have to be first or best in the category. And that's just that is the X on strategy. And actually ended up the day, Zen Studios still ran today, ended up being acquired by Embracer. It's a bit of a disaster, but they did very well and still in existence. The other company, Relive Studios, this is just 2 artists. They are a guy named Dan Borth and Chris Taylor. Great guys, have no business reason to be in business, except they're also passionate about video games. We end up looking, and remember, the original Wii that came out, no one thought it was going to be successful, but we did. And we ended up finding they had a really good relationship with a company called Terminal Reality, which doesn't exist anymore. But they had this video game engine called the Infernal Engine that worked on the Wii. And when the Wii was just absolutely successful, it was like a rocket ship, we ended up having a Wii demo. And we ended up started pitching companies and signing. We actually signed an original IP called Mushroom Men, but then we got Ghostbusters, we had Thor, we had a company called Cook to Be Cook, Star Wars Force Unleashed. And so this 2-person company, without ever shipping anything, it turned from 2 people to well over 100 people, 10+ million in revenue, and in fact created good games. But a couple, again, identifying an underserved market, and it's just critical to kind of have that type of strategy. Also, one thing I learned with them is being fresh is important, because if you release a game and it's 75 Metacritic, well, then you're just known as the 75 Metacritic developer. But if you haven't released anything yet, and you're a new platform, people don't know. So you're kind of held, actually, at a higher regard. You're held on your pedigree of what you shipped before. And people like Dan, they've worked on premium, big AAA titles. They're amazing artists. So they're kind of judged from their past, not from what the company have done. And I think and they end up actually being really niche, as known, as they were kind of 1A developer for doing Wii titles. Now that company, actually very interestingly, this is after I worked with them, they did roll over and actually quietly shut down in the background because they didn't able to make that transition to the next platform. And I think one of the lessons that they would, or if they're up here, would admit is they just became overconfident as a business. And they just felt that they would have a limited runway, and that ended up catching them, say, in the butt. And then the next company, Acronym Games, I was working with, they came out of EA, working on sports titles. So this is one of the lessons I learned. They were kind of my next client I worked with. judged on their sports pedigree. Well, first thing, I ended up getting like a Sony deal, working on their sports title. And we focused on like the Wii market, and this is when like online games was coming to fruition in the PC market. So they ended up getting like the Family Guy online. And ironically enough, they built a very successful business. My next company, which I'll talk about, I ended up acquiring them, and they were part of my acquisition. So full circle. And actually, their founder, a guy named Jesse Jodry, went on to found and still is the CTO of VRChat. So it's really cool learning those lessons along the way. So being an agent, I felt that, it's like a critical piece. I mean, that part of my career just reinforces having a strategy on being first to market, which is like just such an important piece. Like always think about if you're tackling a red ocean in terms of competition, you're not going to break in. And a lot of those companies had the last cycle is like how many failed first-person shooters do we know? Why? Because everyone has a first-person shooter they're playing. It's not a market you want to go after. You want to be thinking, and maybe you can crack the code on a new platform because they don't make the transition, but I think that stuff is done. But there's always new markets forming, and that opportunity, especially scale to an exit, to be strategic, the X is first and best in that category. So, as an agent, which is really interesting, and if anyone here actually works with an agent, it's great. They definitely break the new grounds for you. But as every agent knows, eventually your clients feel they don't need you, and it's always a fight at the end. I was kind of done doing that, but I still had this itch from my first failed startup to do it again. And so I was patient, and there's this opportunity came out. So iOS came out, the game store. And I don't know if people remember, a lot of people, there's a huge startup scene on like, I'm going to do my own iOS title. Like I love the keynote. They were talking about like the time of Zigna. So lots of startups in the space, lots of VC capital, and lots of people started this when the App Store started taking off. I need an app. And while a lot of my friends were rushing to do their startups, I was like, I think there's an opportunity to do the picks and shovels model of doing a services-based startup. And I talk about that first experience of technology reset, iOS developer. Well, there were no iOS developers. There were no Android developers. So we could definitely be like first to market, be a market leader on running a services business. And very interesting, like we got our client like 7-Eleven, Pepsi, off of Craigslist. Craigslist, we posted, and they found us and hired us on the spot because they just couldn't find anyone. And so that was a company, it's founded Finger Food Studios. The name Finger Food was because you use your finger to feed yourself information on your phone. So very focused on just pure services. So I ended up pitching us to a bunch of different publishers. Hey, we do work for hire for iOS and Android titles. Well, no one was really doing that because most of the industry was off to doing original IP and focused on doing their own thing. So it was like definitely a gap in the market. And we ended up getting a contract with Electronic Arts. We ended up getting a contract with IDOS. Like it was like bang, bang, bang. And we ended up having this non-games business of doing apps for premium brands. And as we're going through this first year, we had our, $300,000 revenue first year, second year, $1.2 million, third year, close to $5 million in revenue. So it was like hop, 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 all focused on services. And one of the things that we were identified during that period is that video game industry, $10,000 a month, non-games business, $20,000 a month. Same person, we're like, US. We're like, this non-games business is a thing. So we definitely wanted to nurture and maintain it. And it was kind of shooting fish in the barrel because there's not a lot of people servicing the market, so most people found us in that space. And it was very interesting, our business, we also developed this specialty with Unity. And at the same time, there's this thing called cloud. AWS was released, and was kind of a platform that we're like, wow, this is infinite computing. This is great. We don't have to buy our own servers. So we became experts at AWS, became experts at Unity. And we ended up, guess who ended up knocking our door? It's like Microsoft. They're like, hey, we're developing this Xbox One. We really want to do this, I remember, second screen experiences, all based around Unity. But we also, Azure didn't exist back then. They're like, yeah, we're doing all this cloud stuff, but we can't do AWS work internally. Can you do a bunch of AWS work for Xbox One? We're like, absolutely. And that was definitely, if you think about my original problem with my first company, was we had one client, that client went away, the business went away. We definitely, I fought hard is to also have multiple legs to the studio. So our mainline clients, Electronic Arts, Microsoft, and then we had other bread and butter, like our non-games app business was definitely a leg. Actually, a little fun side note, we ended up doing the first Android app for Shopify, which is, if you know, Shopify is one of the most successful startups. And I actually met Toby and Harley at the time, and we're doing, and their success, by the way, they ended up doing this deal with Angry Birds, was their big kind of wow, they ended up doing millions of sales, just delivery and fulfillment for Angry Birds was their big kind of success moment on this underserved market. So it's just a little side story. But within taking a step back, that type of growth, there are some real learnings in that process. Because one of the things that kind of came to fruition is we had these moments of growth, and we were a small company, so 5 people. It's all hands on deck. I'm a CEO, CFO, project manager, business development. As a CEO, you have to do everything. And especially at that stage, every dollar matters. And part of our strategy was, by the way, we were self-funded. We had no money. We just reinvested our profits. So, the first 6 months, I didn't get paid. And my first founder salary was actually, when we compare ourselves, $60,000 a year. I mean, this was amazing. But one thing I learned, when we went from the 5-person startup to 25 people, of the first 10 people we hired, only 1 remained of our team. And what's really interesting, and it's something as a founder that you're going to have to all experience, what gets you to A is not going to get you to B, is not going to get you to C. And you kind of have to accept that some people aren't going to make the journey with you. And I think as I've grown as a leader in the early stages, most of the people just quit because they felt like we didn't really have a culture where we would train people, because I didn't have an HR director. I was doing work, it was sink or swim mentality at the business. And that's okay. It's we didn't have the resources for that. But I mean, as I've gotten older, I've definitely, and I think it's really important, is knowing where people cap off, where we had and this is my fault as a leader. Because we're growing, I just kept bringing people up the chain with me. But as they move up the chain, the stress level increases and you break people. Some people can't make that journey. And so as a leader, you have to recognize that. And I would have actually kept more people of that first 10 if I would have kind of said, hey, you're a great artist. You're not going to be a great lead artist. You're a great artist, and accept that. And most people have that self-knowledge. It's oh, I don't want to be a leader. I don't want the stress. So I think it's something as you're scaling your business, just recognize it's okay if people can't make that whole journey with you, but it's okay to communicate that you can just be a great individual contributor. You don't have to be a manager. You don't have to join the executive team, because especially at the very top, it is stressful. Because you care and you have passion, and payroll matters, money matters, project matters. Things matter exponentially more than you're just producing on a single project. And so just as a leader, as an entrepreneur, it's always something to recognize. And that rang true all the way up to the 900 people that reported to me. Once we got to a couple hundred people, there's people that could not make the leap to the next level and the next level. And my management team, there's I think 1 person in the first 50 hires that made it to the very top with me as an executive and as a vice president, because it was just such a big leap for people to take and it's a big, I think, The mental gap is you have to be able to let things go, and delegation is extremely hard, right? Most people, because you hire great people, they're passionate. So building that culture of delegation, building a culture that, it celebrates individual contribution. It's not just about being the rock star isn't the manager, the rock star isn't the CEO. One of the greatest pieces of advice, and I go back to that original Blue Shift experience, John Solowich, Doug Snyder, John Brooks, they always sat in the background. They were there with us side by side, but they put everyone in the foreground. They celebrated everyone else's success because they've already made it. Like, they don't need the spotlight on them. And I think that's a great sign of leadership, as someone that can take a step back and celebrate what people are best at and invest in that. And I think that is really a sign of like a great, like an exponential culture drive can help you drive and succeed in kind of that hyper growth phase. So back to kind of those finger food days, we end up, there's like different levels. I'm gonna kind of talk about this. We got to like about the 75 person size, and there's this gap from 75 people to 125. And I was really lean on my finance team, was basically me. HR, I did not have HR all the way to 75 person company, like did not exist in my company. I was HR, and again, sink or swim. And we went up to 120 people, and then we came back to 80 people, both through attrition and through losing projects. And then I tried it again, and then we came back. And I'm like, what am I missing? Well, I'm missing a world-class finance team, so I hired a real CFO. I was missing an HR department and a recruiting department, so I hired a real HR director. And that was like getting those administration functions. I also hired my first business development salesperson. And I think as a leader, that's really my transition to learning how to properly delegate. Like as a CEO, a sales, marketing, pushing CEO, although I'm grounded and actually be able to make things, so I can call bullshit. I'm like, no, I know how to make games, I know how to make products, but I'm definitely oriented, so I can do on my own 8 to 10 million in sales. I cannot do beyond that. And so I also hit my limitations. So also kind of eye-opening. And I go back to companies, I call it compressing the string. There is no such thing as this. There's no straight line. Go look at the stock market. No stock has ever gone like this, even Apple. They go through these cycles of learning. And I think as an entrepreneur and a leader, manager, or wherever your job is, that's okay to go through that cycle as long as you're incorporating those hard-learned lessons in your business. And so once I actually built that management team, we actually crossed the chasm, and then we went on the way to, our next step was 200 people. The 200 person is actually one I sold. But part of that transition, I actually had a business partner. Actually, here's my joke just on this. I was going to do it earlier, but that's not really a joke. What comes first, chicken or the egg? Anyone? The answer is 2 chickens. Being that you need to, I had a business partner. So I'm definitely the sales-oriented leader, and I had an amazing CTO called Trent Shumay. We were partners in the business. I was CEO, CTO. We were the board. And he was an amazing technologist. And so I could just wheel in front of someone, and we would get work every single time. It was like, oh, you're a genius. And then we'd quickly delegate to other people. But I always had confidence if shit hit the fan, he could always come in and solve it. But for him, once we got to the 120 person, 120 people, he couldn't handle the stress. He couldn't actually, and did not want to grow beyond that. And I did. And it was actually, we had some advisors, a guy named Bob Wallace, who some of you may know. I actually worked with Trent and I one-on-one on what it could look like for Trent to exit. Now, I knew I didn't want to take over 100% of the company. I felt that like I needed a partner. And so Trent and I actually negotiated where we actually had a management buyout of him from like the next tier down of people that we felt could take the company to the next level. And I felt this was like a really important, like critical moment of time, because we also brought everybody in the company. We had an ESOP program, so we brought like the whole company brought into equity, because I wanted to, like I had a very clear vision. I wanted to do an exit. Like, I actually had a number I wanted to hit, and I wanted to do an exit. In fact, I actually wanted to go public. I wrote that I wanted to do this. My partner had zero interest in doing this. And so I ended up buying him out for $5 million. So we were 50-50, so we're like a $10 million valuation. And I designed a deal where basically the company and myself financed him to take out $5 million in cash, and we financed all the other staff to be able to buy in to do the management buyout. And I actually had and for me, like I put my ass way out there to be able to do that. That's a maximum. Basically, he said that's what I can afford, and that's how we came up with the valuation. And just to be clear, even though I exited, I'll tell you the next part of the story. Trent and I are still best of friends because he got what he wanted. He had his golden ring, and he's happy. The stress was going to kill him. And if you saw him today, two pictures of like before and after, he looks way healthier and he's happy. And I think that's before you go into building your own business, have a personal goal. Like, what is enough? I think a lot of people keep going and they go like, it's like too much. They don't have a very clear, articulated personal goal. And I always say, if you write things down, they happen. So this is, I think, the very interesting part of the story. This is our path to selling to Unity. So we sat down as a management team, and one of the things I learned from my time as an agent, we would go and create a demo, and we had our own IP, and we would go pitch it to all the publishers. And the publishers would say, you know what, we're not really interested in doing original IP, but would you build this game? And by the way, that was a strategy, and that's how we end up getting like Ghostbusters and Thor, because you kind of present yourself and let other people project their ideas into it. So that was a strategy that we went around and we said, well, we really like the non-games business, and one of the key pivots that we did as a business is the thing around 2016 came around is the HoloLens. And we ended up taking this program to go down to Microsoft, and we did some of the very first applications on the HoloLens. And what we're famous for is we worked with a company called PACCAR, which is the largest truck manufacturer in the world, DAF, Kenworth, if you see a truck, it's likely built by them. And we went down to their R&D center. I don't know if you know this, but truck designers, they use clay models, but like full scale. There's like a 3D printer of clay. Then they by hand craft what it could look like. And then their executives come and say, I don't like it. And then they break it all up and do it all over again. And it takes 4 years to develop a new truck design. And it's kind of a crazy process. And we're like, I think we have an idea for application. Why don't we use a hologram? So let's say the process of doing, so it took about 6 months to do from concept, so AutoCAD, to a clay model. We spent 6 weeks and we got the process down to basically 2 days. We took an AutoCAD, we had a bunch of data cleanup, and we put HoloLens on. And especially with the HoloLens, some of you may have used it where you're like, oh, it's the field of view is too small. That's because the object's too small. At large scale, it's a magical experience. And we cheated because, one, we were experts at Unity. We had a rendering engineer, graphics designer, versus everyone even at Microsoft, we were blew people away. And then I went around at the time, I said, well, hey, there's a business here. And Microsoft said, hey, we want to show this to all our clients. So we ended up going to, we ended up going to Walmart, who we end up show them this, got a project, a company called Enbridge, mining companies, and we started growing this big, which we called, and I don't say coined, a digital twin business. And so I went up, and so part of being, we were like first in the category, and we're known to be the best. So I ended up creating a pitch deck, said, hey, I'm gonna raise $20 million to go build a digital twin platform. Went out pitching that to a bunch of different companies, and instantly we had two offers. We had one from Accenture for $80 million, which was like, holy shit. And we had a second offer from Unity Technologies for $55 million, another $15 million in stock options. And it was quite the decision. What do you take? Like the cash in hand? And all our advisors said, take the 80 million. And I said, no, because I knew Unity wanted to go public, so we decided to take the Unity offer. And that deal ended up becoming quite amazing because we ended up getting our stock options at $19. I ended up getting the shares, which we took 60% in shares, so probably like around 35 million in stock at $25 a share. Well, at the top of the market, which we could all sell, it was worth $200. So that deal ended up being not 55 million, over $400 million. And now, obviously, we took a lot of risk to doing that. And I ended up taking, and this is like the very crazy part of the journey, having to be able to really contribute to that. So I ran the professional services unit, but I was the fastest growing unit in the business. And at that time, because the stock market was crazy, every dollar was treated equally. So I ended up growing the business. My CAGR was like, I grew 100% the first year, 80% the second year. I was there for 3.5, then 60%. Well, that growth rate gave us that high valuation. And for every dollar I made, it was worth 60 in the market. So Unity was super happy for the deal. And after 3.5 years of the craziness, I had an incredible management team. And at the time, the business was like, hey, we don't need a professional services unit anymore. So they actually sold half my business to Capgemini and kept the games business internally. And that was my opportunity to go, peace. And so leaving Unity, I've taken a year off. And a little bit of a side note, that was quite the journey. When I left Unity, I actually experienced my second bout of real depression. I couldn't get out of bed for almost like 4 months. And I saw my doctor, and it was a pretty good relationship. She's like, Ryan, workaholics need rehab too. Because I was so used to just the grind and the dopamine hit every single day, my body had to recover. So I just kind of grinded it out, and good support from my family and friends. And then here I am today giving the speech about it. So thank you. This is my Q&A time. I have 5 minutes of Q&A. Peace. There we go. 10 minutes. There we go. I did it. So any questions? All right, Tyrone, thank you.
Oh, sorry. I've got...
Talk about that step of delegating to...
I think it's on.
Yeah, you talk about the step of delegating to the leadership within your studio. Can you speak more about some of the challenges you have in letting go, and I guess how not only for yourself that you need to let go, but others need to do that as well?
Yeah, so I think it's really interesting. So part of delegation is, if people get to know me, there's a key thing that I needed to teach the team. And so one of the core foundations of any business and culture is trust. But the next layer is teaching the people the ability to embrace conflict. And it's really interesting. So I've actually have some amazing coaches, and they taught me this, is that when I say conflict, and we'll do a little exercise here with all of you. I want everybody in the room to go back to your earliest memory, your very earliest memory. So when you were the little you, so probably before 7 years old. And what's your first experience of conflict? So just get that picture in the mind. Was it slamming doors, yelling, unresolved issues? Anybody? Or was it silence, cold feeling, conflict avoidance? Now, how many people in this room remember grown-up adults, conversation, questions of curiosity, and like a mature conflict resolution? Does anyone have that as their first memory? I don't. Now you know why you avoid conflict. And I think that was a critical thing to teach my team. And they all, in just a little exercise, maybe worth as a leader to do in smaller groups, and especially your key management teams, at all levels, is have people share their first memory of conflict. And everyone has the aha moment. And then teach people to be curious, ask questions. Because conflict, and actually I have a client where I was recently, they know who they are, I don't prescribe anything. I work my whole life, leading is through asking questions. I may have the answer, but that's how you resolve, find conflict. And what happens when you can resolve conflict, you get commitment from one another. When you're committed to each other, it drives results. And that becomes a high-performance team. And that's the way to delegate. The key is being a great teacher. Other questions? Here, go for it.
You hear me better?
Yeah.
How do you identify the longevity and quality of an emerging underserved market?
Yeah, I think that's great. I think research. So I'm a history major. And so I do more research than anyone. And and it was actually a point brought up earlier in the first keynote. History repeats itself, always. And I go back, so I actually looked, so this would be worthwhile, read about the history, the early days of Hollywood. If you take the early days of Hollywood and you look at our video game industry, there's a lot of similarities. And so like TV, mobile apps, movies, AAA titles. Look at all the consolidation that's going on. Like it always happens. So new markets emerge, but definitely look at historical data of what sold and what didn't. Those markets are still there. And the one thing about the video game industry, there's always new waves of people. And one of the things I'm going to point that I've been talking to, Alexander, thank you, was conversations. Well, what's an underserved market right now? Southeast Asia, LTAM, so like different foreign markets. You have a huge wave of people with new money that want to spend and like entertainment. And I think there's massive opportunity. It's a whole new wave of players. And so that's an underserved market. A good friend of mine, it's like the female market is completely underserved. There's like you actually talk about slot machines, a company called SciPlay Games. They have Jackpot Party Casino. They're number one in rate. They're the best year ever. Focus on females 40 to 90. Right? So like just, again, through research, you can find these markets. And then find your passion. Do something fucking amazing to serve an underserved market. You will find success. One more question. Okay. Well, I'll go there because you can ask me privately. Yeah. 2 more questions.
In regards to the finger food team, how did you create the initial team and what did that look like?
Well, so through friends. So one of our strategy is that we couldn't afford great people, so we always said if you can't get a job at Microsoft and Amazon, we'd hire you. So our big thing was, because I think my partner Trent and I were very good, like we were at the top of our game in our own field, we sold people, if you work with us for 2 to 3 years, you can do anything you want because we're going to make you the best in your category. And I would say everyone that worked for us, even in those early stages, like they're all employed and all did amazing things. So I think that's the key thing is, be a teacher. And I go back to that. A great leader is a great teacher, and people are looking for that. Okay, 30 seconds. Any more? Alexander, do you want to?
Yeah, you do the initial management buyout of your partner. How long was that process to go from conversation to close?
Okay, so just repeat the question. How long was the conversation, the process to, started the conversation to close of buying out my partner? It took a year. because it was very emotional. And I think that's an okay part of the process, like accept the emotion. There's so much attachment. And still today, even though I have an incredible success and the whole team, Trent and I are still best of friends. And he's nothing but happy because he got what we wanted. The best deals are deals where it's fair at the time. Like, because he respects I took the risk, and I gave him what he wanted at the time.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah. We're done. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you for my talk. Yeah.